All right. So, let's go. We're going to give everybody time to trickle in as people slowly make their way here. Um, Obviously, we were having some issues, but we are here for Psych 101. Today, we are continuing our lecture from last week, in which we were discussing the history, and now today we are going to thank you, Divine. Thank you for the likes. We were having some technical difficulty in which the TikTok studio was not letting me actually like log in and go live. So that's why we're a few minutes late, but that's okay. We are here to share the information with you. So we're going to finish up the last little bit of history, and then we're going to move into research of Psych 101. Next week we'll be starting conditioning and learning. How we learn. And I'm not in your class, I was just coming in to show you some love. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Divine. Thank you, Divinely, excuse me. Thank you. I appreciate that. I just love sharing this information. I've been a professor for 17 years. I'm very passionate about the psychology field, and I've been working in social services for 22, 23 years. We've been here for a minute. I'm just counting down towards retirement. I'm in college for psychology. This is more fun than college. Thank you, Hira. Thank you for being here. If you have questions, anybody go ahead and ask. I truly appreciate everybody for being here. So let's just finish out history. So we're going to talk about working in the field. And like I just said, I've worked in the field for 22 years. I've worked as a one-to-one for a student who was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. I've worked in group homes, supervised apartments. I've worked in day programs, and also now, obviously I'm working, in office environment in that sense. And so it's very important. I tell everybody, all my psych students, before you graduate, get your experience. Before you graduate, get experience. Work in the day programs, work in group homes, work in schools. Get the experience, paid experience. So outside of your internships, if your school has you do an internship, not every school does, make sure you are getting that experience. And I say this because you'll move up faster in the field. Because once you get out of college, you don't have experience yet, right? So it's very important that you take your time, get the experience, so then once you're walking out, you have a year of experience and a degree, and now you can move up faster in the psych field. Okay? So, working in the field, first up, you have psychologists. And there's 3 broad categories that psychologists fall into. Those 3 are teaching and doing research in colleges and universities, providing mental or health services like a psychological practice, and then last but not least, you have conducting research and applying the findings in non-academic settings. So that's business, sports, military, government, law, etc., etc. So psychology is very versatile. You can basically find a role in the psych profession in almost any other field. It's very broad. It's out there. So please keep that in mind. Which is why I love how much I enjoy it, because there's so much versatility in the field. Right? I'm sorry, I'm trying to make sure I have my notes. So moving on, there's various types of psychologists between experimental, developmental, educational, industrial, organizational. So your industrial organizational psychologists, those are the ones who basically are studying the work behavior, the behavior in the workplace, if you will. So what does that mean? So that means these are individuals who, if you've ever taken one of those tests to see, like, oh, have you ever stolen? Would you ever steal? Blah, 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 blah. For entrance to some type of interview or job that you're looking to do, an industrial organizational psychologist came up with that. Obviously, you know, your educational psychologists, they explain learning and search for ways to improve educational systems and things of that sort, right? And so keep that in mind as you continue on in this field and decide what you would enjoy. Next up, you have your psychological um, practice. So what falls underneath of that? So you have your counseling psychologist, so they help people deal with the problems of everyday life. And what does that look like, such as anxiety, family conflicts, or anything of that sort? Then you have your school psychologists, and your school psychologists work with parents, teachers, students, and really help to support them in their student performance. You have clinical psychologists. This is what most people think of, and they are somebody who diagnoses, treats, and studies mental and emotional problems. And then you have your psychotherapist, does any kind of psychotherapy. They are not as heavily regulated in most states, so keep that in mind if you are working with anybody. If you see that the psychotherapist is not as legally heavily regulated, so anybody can call themselves a psychotherapist, so be really mindful of that. And then you have a psychoanalyst. We talked last week about Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. So this is the person who truly practices psychoanalysis. They specialize in that field. And down the line, we will talk about psychoanalysis and the therapy that's associated with it, so you can learn a little bit more about that. And the most important one that everybody thinks of is your psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist, think of it this way. That's your medical doctor. They are the only one who can prescribe medication. They have to do 3 years of residency in a psychiatry to properly diagnose and treat mental disorders. And with that in mind, since they're the only ones who actually can diagnose and treat mental disorders, they are basically able to write those prescriptions. Okay, so I'm repeating myself there. I personally wanted to become a psychiatrist. I was very interested in becoming a psychiatrist. I wanted to do that. However, I recognize that I couldn't do the medical school part of it. The thought of actually having to go through full medical school to become a psychiatrist, I had to tap out. Because I knew I couldn't deal with the blood and the dead bodies and all that. Because you do a full, rotation. If you ever watch any of those shows, Grey's Anatomy, that could never be me. So I had to bow out and recognize that I would have to be a counselor and I could not become a psychiatrist. But it is actually a very rewarding field just working in it. But I wanted to finish up that from last week's lecture. We're about to get into research and how you would conduct research in the psych field. So this is research and statistics for psychology majors. All right, we are not going to go heavy into the math of it and everything like that. We're just going to touch briefly on some topics, but I want to make sure you understand how you would actually do research in psychology. And if you're going to continue on in this field at some point in time, you're going to have to do a master's thesis. You might go on to do your dissertation. You might have to do various studies. You'll find that college students are the biggest and easiest pool of test subjects. So my Psych 101 professor, you either could write a paper or you could go do experiments. Literally, they would have you sign up for experiments. And I knew the game, and I refused to sign up for those experiments. I was like, I'm going to write a paper. You are not going to use me as your test data. That is not what I am. I'm sorry, but no. Let me just move this out the way. So we're going to go right into research. So, research as a psychologist. So think of it this way. You have a basic hunch. There's something you think about. There's something you wonder about. And we talked about this last week. And from there, you develop a theory, which is your organized system of assumptions. So you take that basic assumption that you had the previous week and you build on it, those principles. You explain more about that certain phenomenon that you wonder about. So I'm going to come up with a theory, and for the most part, we're going to use it throughout explaining how we would do our research. So my theory is people who are well versed in the TikTok universe are able or be more likely to survive a zombie apocalypse. We're just going to go with that, because I like zombies. I've always, I feel like that's going to happen. So let's go with that. So from there, that was just a basic theory. It's just all over the place, but so we got to clean it up. We got to make it a hypothesis. So it's a statement that attempts to describe or explain a given behavior. So with that, your hypothesis will be, I think my theory is probably pretty close to a hypothesis because I was automatically thinking about it. So my hypothesis would be something along the lines of, after taking a survival course, individuals who participate in the use of TikTok are more likely to survive a zombie apocalypse. So that's our hypothesis. So you set it up that way because you want to be able to prove it right or wrong. If your hypothesis cannot be proven wrong because of the way you word it, it is not a strong hypothesis. You have to go back and you have to rewrite your hypothesis and take that time to figure it out. So a hypothesis, after a while, you kind of get really good at explaining what a hypothesis is, and you will be able to write a hypothesis very quick because basically you want to be able to prove it right or wrong. And that actually moves us on to confirmation bias. So again, we are getting into the statistics and experiments and everything like that, but psych majors, we got to do it. Like, I'm sorry, it's just what it is. So if we're going with our original, welcome in, Youngles. I see you. I appreciate you pulling up. If we're going with our original hypothesis of having some type of survival course to survive a zombie apocalypse, we got to be careful of what is called a confirmation bias. So what is a confirmation bias? So that is basically a trap. You're only going to look for evidence that confirms your hypothesis and does not reject it. So this is really, really important. When you are looking at any peer-reviewed journals, any research, Artie, it's okay. I was late too. The TikTok Studio app was just not working, so don't even worry about it. Thank you for the likes. I appreciate that. So anytime you look at any research, any statistics, any numbers, take that time to dig more, because there's certain research gets rid of any evidence that will deny their hypothesis. And that is always a concern if they are not ethical researchers. And I want you all to be ethical researchers here. Okay? So you have to accept all evidence, even if it proves your hypothesis wrong. Accept the evidence. And you have to share it all because you want to be able, I'm going to jump ahead. So let me not jump that too far. Okay. So, population versus sample. So if we are, again, going back to if the individuals in our population, let me rephrase that, our hypothesis, I should have wrote the hypothesis down. It is more likely that individual who has taken a survival course is more likely to survive a zombie apocalypse, right? So that is our hypothesis, or something of that sort. Our population versus sample. Now, I said anybody who uses the TikTok app who takes this survival course is more likely to survive. So that population will then include everybody in the world who uses TikTok. That is not feasible. There is not enough research money in the world to be able to get every single person who uses TikTok to be our part of our population for us to study. We just can't do it. There's not enough money. We got to let it go. So instead, we use what is called a sample. So that is a small snapshot of our population. It has to be random, but it's a small snapshot. And that is more feasible. That you can then extrapolate to the population in general. And that is why we do that representative sample. Okay? That makes sense? I would hope so. Yeah, I did dust off my, excuse me. Do we need reaction papers to, do we send reaction papers to the email? You can. I wasn't going to force everybody, but I will read it, and I just want to hear your thoughts, and I will grade it and send it back. So that is totally up to you. Okay? So it's totally up to you. If you want to do the reaction papers, I am not going to give you a failing grade if you don't do it. But why I do reaction papers in my Psych 101 class, I want you to demonstrate that you understood the material, but I also want you to get used to writing in psychology. I want you to get used to taking the information presented and putting it in your own words. Because if you're, as you know, on the college level, you're not using block quotes like we did in high school. You're not. You're paraphrasing everything and putting it in on your own words and then citing it accordingly. You are not doing huge long quotes. And reaction papers helps prepare my students for that. And I've had students come back to me later like, Professor, thank you, because I had to turn around and write a 15-page paper, but I was okay because I knew how to write. So that is why I have that in there. Even though I'm just the psych professor, I'm not the English professor, I want to make sure my students are prepared for future classes. And when you have to start turning out those research papers, oh baby, the amount of papers you're just typing. In psychology, just get used to typing because that's all you're going to be doing. Okay, so where are we moving on to? So again, research for psych majors. You have descriptive methods. So they describe behavior, but they do not explain why. Descriptive methods, you can say there's an influence. You can say there's some type of relationship, but at no point in time can you say A causes B. Okay? Descriptive methods, great information, but you cannot say A causes B. All right? I'm going to make sure you guys understand that. With that in mind, we have first up our case study. So a case study is a detailed description of one individual. It's based on careful observation, data, and things of that sort, maybe some psychological testing. Either way, you learn a lot about this person. So we say an individual who may be a survivalist that lives in the woods, and you study that person, you learn a lot about them, their psychological makeup and everything, why they decide to live this life and things of that sort. But at no point in time can you generalize that to the population. Remember, we talking about population and sample. If your sample is too small, i.e. one person, I cannot generalize that out to everybody. That one person is unique. You'll learn a lot about them, but you cannot generalize that information out. Next, you have observational study. So this study is when you systematically observe and record behavior, but you do not interfere. There used to be a show on MTV called True Life. And on that show, they would just follow people around. And they didn't stop them when they did dangerous behavior. And this is the same thing. You will not stop whoever you are observing. If it might be a large group of people, they might engage in risky behaviors, but you're just watching. You are not going to interfere at all. Obviously, you can do it in a natural setting or a lab setting. Either setting works, but you are just watching and you are not going to interfere at all, which can be hard, especially if you know the person's about to do something dangerous. It can be hard on the researcher to not stop them from doing something dangerous. So keep that in mind as you decide the type of research you want to do. This might not be for you because you might be like, I can't let you do this to yourself. Let's see. Then we have correlational study. So correlational study looks for a relationship between two phenomenon and how they influence each other. So a great example that is often used is SAT scores in SAT prep class. So if the individual takes the SAT prep class, they are more likely to have a higher score with the SAT prep class. So therefore, that's a positive correlation. Having one has the other one go up, and then so on and so forth. And you go from there. So that is your example of a correlational study. There's a relationship between two phenomena. Okay. Again, ask any questions in the chat. You are more than welcome. Experimental method. Here we go. This is the one that you see in Mythbusters. It's a controlled test of the hypothesis. Okay? So you are taking that hypothesis and you are putting it to the test. Oh, anytime, Artie. I know this isn't as exciting as like the meatiness of psychology, but you got to get through it. It's the building blocks of psychology. Okay? So, we got to talk about it, cuz how do we get here? Where am I at? Experimental method. Cuz I know I have to jump back and forth. So, the experimental method, we're going to take our hypothesis and we're going to really put it to the test. And there's a lot of steps to the experiment. And that's why you can say with the experimental method, A causes B. You couldn't do that with the descriptive method, but experimental method, you can. Because you're going to control all the outside variables. We're going to make sure that nothing else is influencing our experiment. So let's see. We are going to come up with the experiment because originally our hypothesis was more of a correlation about the zombies. So we'll say a hair growth pill, right? That's easy. So if the individual takes this hair growth pill, their hair should grow long and full and thick, right? So it's just the easy one, easy example to come up with real quick. So we are now having to set up our experiment for this hair growth pill. We'll call it Do Grow. Do Grow is the name of our fictitious pharmaceutical drug. So first step is your control group. Your control group is a group of individuals that will not receive our magical hair growth serum. So because they're not going to receive it, we'll know if people's hair will grow. That we're going to compare them to the next group, which is our experimental group. Obviously, our experimental group is the one who will receive the magical hair serum. And hopefully, if everything works out great, the experimental group will have more hair growth than our control group. That means, wow, our magical do grow hair serum actually works. Then you have what is called a random assignment. So what a random assignment is, if we have 1,000 participants as for our sample, you're just gonna toss names into the basket. Some people go into the control group, some people go to the experimental group. You're not gonna pay attention to anything. You want this to be as random as possible. Because if you start hand picking who goes into what group, you might set up for your results to be skewed. Because you might unconsciously, subconsciously, etc., put certain people in certain groups because you think this person will perform better, and now you've messed up your whole experiment. Placebo, this is something that you've heard of a lot. Placebo could be a water pill, is fake, is not real. So that if you do a placebo, that means you should set up your experiment to have 3 groups. Your first group is your control group. They don't receive the serum. The second group is your experimental group. They will receive the serum. And your third group is your placebo group. They'll think they've received the serum. Because psychology, as we talk about this, mind over matter, our mind is really strong. And if the placebo group has their hair grow more than the experimental group, then our magical hair serum's just not working. Our magical hair serum's just not as important. So welcome in everybody who's just joining. We are talking about research as psych majors. So placebo. What do we get next? Single blind study. So a single blind study is when the participants do not know which group they're in. So you'll do this because, again, mind over matter. If people know for a fact that they're not even receiving the real serum, they're going to stop caring. They're going to stop if we're doing hair growth serum. They might not even take the medication. They might do things that might damage their hair and things of that sort. And that's why we do a single blind study. We do not want the participants to know when we're doing our experiment as a psychologist which group they're going to fall into. Or a clinician. I'll say clinician. We don't want them to know. A double blind study is when the participants and the researcher do not know which group is which. Now you're going to ask the question, why would we set it up like that? A double blind study? Why would we want the experimenter not to know? And the reason why we do this is because we want to avoid what is called experimenter effects. And what those are is when the subject behavior changes based off of non-verbal cues or sometimes verbal cues from the experimenter. So what does that mean? What does that look like? So if I'm the researcher, I know this person has the placebo. I know our placebo is our, again, going back to our hairdo serum. And I'm like talking to them and I realize, thank you, Nina, for the follow, like conflict of interest type energy. Exactly. So if I realize that they are taking the placebo, but their hair grew more than the experimenter group, I might be like, that's weird. Or I might make a face. And now my subject realizes, oh, wait, my hair should not have grown because I don't really have the serum. And you can mess up your own research. So that's why you put a lot of these systems in place to make sure whatever research you're doing as a clinician is as flawless as possible. You don't want to do years of research, in some cases, waste a lot of money before you have to throw out your whole experiment. And that's why I constantly tell people, read the whole experiment. Don't just read the overview that goes out there. Read who participated. Was there other factors that they picked with that particular group? Was there a reason why anybody was excluded? Because sometimes they'll exclude people who they know will not perform well. You need to look at all of that information. I think there was recently a experiment, research that went out saying the use of cannabis was linked to heart disease. And so I was talking to some other people and they were very upset about that. They're like, oh, that's so wrong and blah, blah, blah. I was like, well, wait a minute. Let's take a moment. Let's look at the data. Can you send me that information? Send me the research. Because I don't want you to become upset because they might say it has to be a person who's over a certain age, a person who falls into this category, person who also utilizes nicotine, etc., etc. And then you realize that the statistics is only for a very particular population that not everybody falls into. So Artie says, I've grown up with a deep interest in psychological papers. I'm excited to one day write one myself. It's so much fun to watch your paper come together. Thank you everybody for the likes. I truly appreciate that. I'm sorry if I did not say that originally, but thank you so much. So where am I at? Yes, so always take your time to look at the research. Do not take statistics at face value. The math can look good. Ooh, it'll look good. But if you know what you're doing, you can make the numbers lie. And that's the honest truth. So please keep that in mind. Let's see. I'm trying to stay on. There we go. All right. So there's some common studies that kind of sit off on their own from the ones I previously discussed. So some of those studies include, first up is your cross-sectional study. So this is different ages at a set time that are compared. Okay. So if you're doing a cross-sectional study, what does that look like? So a cross-sectional study is when you do different ages at set time and you compare them. So what does that mean? So it's a snapshot in time. So if we're going to study let's see, what are we going to study? We'll study hair length. I don't know. We'll study hair length. It's your hair. But we're going to look at it at different set times. So the hair length of 20-year-olds in the 50s versus hair length of 20-year-olds in the 80s versus hair length of 20-year-olds in today's age of 2024. So we're just doing a snapshot of like every 40 or so years. We're going to look at it. We're going to compare it. You can't really generalize it, but you can see that there's a difference, that there's a change in the ages of time. And I love watching those videos where they show all the hairstyles throughout the ages and how they've changed so much, and sometimes they've repeated. And I enjoy watching that. I'm just a nerd. I just love anything that I can learn about and why things have changed. So it's different ages at set time and you compare them to see what has changed. After that, you have longitudinal studies. So it's literally what it sounds like. It is a long study. You're following the same set of subjects over a long period of time. So you might look at 5-year-olds And you'll follow those same group of 5-year-olds for 40 years. So, thank you so much for the likes. I appreciate that. It will yield a wealth of information. You'll learn so much. But it's very hard to keep your subjects for 40 years. People disappear, people no longer want to participate, and things of that sort. It is also a very costly study because you got to run it for 40 years. And grants dry up. Research money goes away. And therefore, your longitudinal study might end before you even have a chance to finish it. And the last one is called a meta-analysis, and it's a study of studies. I heard twins go through sometimes in certain states. It's very interesting. Let me just do a meta-analysis, and I'm going to come back to those twin studies, because I've always had a bone to pick with about those twin studies. Meta-analysis, you study different studies. So it's like, what? Professor, what are you saying right here? So what that means is you do not have to deal with participants at all. You are going to find studies that are already conducted that are similar to whatever you are looking at, and you are going to compile all their information, and that is your study. This is very hard to convince your advisor to let you write for your dissertation or for your thesis. They'll be like, no, you need to actually go get participants. But sometimes you might get away with that. I did have somebody in my grad school class who was able to do a meta-analysis. My advisor was like, oh no, we're going to do it right. And we're going to get into that in a minute. So you had a thought about twin studies. So, twin studies. I know, I'm like, there we go. If we're going to study people, first things first is informed consent. Okay? You have to tell them as much as possible about your experiment so they can make an informed decision. Sometimes they don't follow that. We have APA ethical guidelines that protect the participants because you're not supposed to do any harm at all. Now, previously, that is not what was in place. Oftentimes, there's some manipulation that happens, especially in twins, especially identical twins. And for some reason, why we had such a large number of twins that were raised separately, but were able to be researched on? I always had that question. I've always asked my professors. I'm like, Professor, between you and me, we know that this was not ethical. We know that something was wrong. Why are so many twins being raised separately in so many different types of environments, and now you're writing research papers on them? It can't be that many separated twins. It really can't be. But luckily, we put guidelines in place. Sadly, we didn't put them in place until almost, the 80s? And we're still refining those guidelines. We learned so much great information during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But again, we're supposed to do no harm. If you are going to conduct some type of research doing your thesis or your dissertation, you have to go to a review board. You have to present your whole experiment. You have to say how long you're going to keep your data, how are you going to go about destroying it, what is the level of anonymity for the participants, so on and so forth. And they can say no to your experiment, and you have to start over or revamp it. So keep that in mind. You can't just do what you want. Yes, Indigenous boarding schools did this to my community members as well. 60 schools. Exactly. They don't want to talk about it. But there's a lot of experiments that was done in psychology that are wrong. We learned a lot. We learned so much about the psychological nature of humans through these experiments, but they caused a lot of harm. And we're going to talk about some of the experiments in the future. Same thing with studying on animals. I don't think I have that on there, but you can't get away with things like you used to in the name of science. Not to say there's still people that are doing some illegal experiments, because obviously you can't stop that. You can try to crack down on it, but we have to do no harm. People, animals, everything, etc., etc. And that is basically research as a psychologist. Yeah. So does anybody have questions? Next week we're doing conditioning and learning. I promise it's way more exciting. I promise it is way more exciting than this. But we got to get through history and research before we get into the fun stuff, which is your motivation, your emotion, your conditioning, your learning, your emotions. We're going to dive into all of that. And it might start a debate, which I love to hear what everybody thinks. But either way, I appreciate everybody for being here. The lecture will be up on the YouTube video, on the YouTube channel, so make sure you hit that follow so you get that information there. And yeah, so I want everybody to enjoy their night. As always, I am a professor who won't keep you long. If you would like to write a paper on the material, you're more than welcome to. You can send it over to me. I definitely check it out and respond. You don't have to do an attachment. Just copy and paste it and put it right into the document. Right into the email, and I'll read it. Just want to hear your thoughts on the material, and I can't wait to dive into next week. So Nina, thank you so much. Artie, thank you so much. People who have been popping in and out, again, thank you. Thank you for all the likes. And yeah, until we meet again next week, it will be back to Tuesday because I just had a meeting yesterday. I couldn't move it, so I had to move the lecture to today. As always, keep up on the syllabus because it's going to change based off of my availability. We're going to basically go for 8 p.m. EST, and as long as TikTok Studio works, we'll get this pretty presentation. But if you see me just on my phone, that means TikTok Studio was messing up so much that I had to just use my phone. And then you don't get the pretty everything and the pretty PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint will be available in the description of the YouTube video. All right, everybody, enjoy your night. Bye.